1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to First Reform UCC in downtown Lancaster, where we are an open and affirming church, meaning whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcomed and loved at First Reformed Church. My name is the Reverend Devin Jeffers, and I am the lead pastor here, and we're so glad to have you with us on tonight. We'd like to say good evening to all of you that are watching. If you would do us a favor in the comments, could you say where you're watching and where you are located? We'd love to stay in contact with you. And we are hosting this with the Pine Street Presbyterian Church. So good evening to all of the members at Pine Street. Good evening to you. Thank you so much for watching on tonight. And we are hosting this adult forum featuring the Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. And Dr. Lovelace will deliver a series of lectures on the theme, Who's Your Mama? Why Does It Matter in the Old Testament and Today in the Politics of Belonging? And this is based on her book entitled A Womanist Reading of Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. Dr. Lovelace is an associate dean and associate professor of Old Testament Hebrew Bible at Lancaster Theological Seminary of Moravian University in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And we invite you to join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. for these adult forums. We'd also like for you to purchase and check out her book. You can go to lexingtonbook.com/Fortress Academic. And the code there that you could use is LXFANDF30 when ordering, and all of this information will be on the rebroadcast and in the email so that you could be able to stay in contact with her. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our presenter on tonight, the one and only Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. But right before she comes, let's open up with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this moment. We thank you for this time. And we pray tonight that something said and something done will empower us, would wake something up inside of us that will cause things to wrestle within us. We thank you for Dr. Lovelace, and we pray, God, that you would bless her presentation and all that will view. Be with the members of First Reform. Be with the members of Pine Street. And thank you, God, for being with us in this moment. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Let's receive Dr. Lovelace.
Good evening. I would first like to extend my thanks to Beth Allwine at Pine Street Presbyterian Church in Harrisburg for the invitation to lead their adult education series in the month of February in celebration of Black History Month, and to Pastor D at First Reformed Church, United Church of Christ, for accepting my invitation to partner with Pine Street Church. When I received the invitation from Beth a year ago, and as it came back around and she reminded me of the invitation, I I said, I would really love to do that, but I could not in good conscience do that and not do something for my church. And so that's how this partnership came about, and I hope there will be other opportunities for us to collaborate. And thank you to all of you who have joined us in person. I imagine some were not certain whether or not they'd try and come out tonight with the warning of the impending snow and ice. Hopefully it's not going to come until 10 o'clock, so we'll all get home safely. And I am grateful for your interest in this month's series. And to those of you online as well on YouTube, I welcome you. This lecture series is titled, Who's Your Mama? Why It Matters in the Old Testament and Today in the Politics of Belonging. And it is, each week I will cover a chapter from my book, A Womanist Reading of the Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. So let's get started. How did I get here? I have asked myself. How did I become so focused in my recent scholarship about mothers and motherhood in the Hebrew Bible text and contemporary U.S. context, beginning with Sarah and Hagar? I am a mother. I have 3 children. Had never intended to be a mother, had not planned to be a mother, was not ever concerned about motherhood. And I think I'm a good mother. I think the kids would say I've done okay, but it was just not something that I considered just the most important thing that I could do in life. And I have been surprised, therefore, by the turn that my research has took in maternal matters. I side with researchers who argue that maternal instinct is a myth that men created. Even my dissertation was on Deborah and Huldah, 2 childless women prophets. And so my journey began with a sociological, methodological approach to interpreting biblical narratives that defined as the politics of belonging by sociologist Nira Yuval Davis. According to Nira Yuval Davis, belonging is an emotional attachment, such as the warm sentiments one gets about feeling at home. We hope that when people enter our church doors, they feel at home, they feel that they belong. But the politics of belonging are the political projects that construct belonging to a specific polity. The politics of belonging is about who decides who gets to be a member, who's an insider and who's an outsider, and the processes that they engage in to make those determinations. And we see this play out in the biblical narratives and in our own society. The other framework used that you've heard a couple of times now is a womanist hermeneutic. The term womanist, popularized by poet, author, and activist Alice Walker in her widely acclaimed publication In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose, in 1983, is derived from a term rooted in U.S. Southern Black women's culture, womanish, a word used to describe an attempt to inhibit female adolescent behavior that was strong, outrageous, and inappropriate for their age, as in, you acted womanish, like you're acting a little too grown. Womanist is a title that also denotes my unwavering commitment to the wholeness of the Black community in general, and Black and other women of color in particular. A womanist approach examines phenomena such as gender and race from a simultaneously overlapping view for how they operate, how those identities operate to discriminate against women of color, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. 19th century Black women activists such as Maria Stewart, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Sojourner Truth, their work, their activism as African Americans and women named even if they didn't have a term for it, the simultaneity of their oppression as black and female. But it was law professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in the 20th century who also recognized that an individual's subjectivity is not impacted by race as one single category, and by gender as one single category, and by class as essentially mutually exclusive categories. She explained that an individual's experiences were shaped by multiple and overlapping categories. Crenshaw applied a legal theoretical framework to the phenomenon of multidimensionality, that's a lot, of multidimensionality and its relationship to power in her investigation of how race and gender intersected to discriminate against US Black women and make them invisible within their multiple political constituencies. She named that dynamic intersectionality. Thus, Crenshaw mapped the failure of feminist theory and anti-racist politics to recognize discrimination against Black women on account of race and gender simultaneously, and not exclusively as Blacks or women. And she used the analysis of an intersection. She describes if you're in an intersection and you get hit by one car, and then you kind of spin out of control, and then you get hit by another car. The ambulance is not going to come along and say, well, was it the car that hit you going north and south, or was it the car that hit you going east-west? That's going to determine whether or not we're going to treat you, but that it's both and that can impact you, and so that's why she called it intersectionality. Ironically, a biblical narrative that I found well-suited for demonstrating my methodological approaches, combining an intersectional analysis of women affected by and who were affecting national projects. One of the things that Nira Yuval Davis also introduced was she and Floya and Thias were the first to coin the theory of feminist theory of gender and nation, where they argued, although people always think of nationalist projects as male and that it's our founding fathers, and that women don't have anything to do with it, but in fact that women, at least 5 different processes, as mothers, as the signifiers of nation, they're often symbolic figurations of nation, as the cultural bearers, in other ways, that nonetheless women impact the national processes. And so I saw this in the story of Sarah and Hagar in Genesis 16 and 21. It's a case study not only in motherhood, but also the power dynamics that end up impacting who is an insider and who's an outsider, who gets included as a member of the nation of Israel and who gets excluded. And so for many Black women, religious scholars who embraced a womanist framework, Hagar was their patron saint. Her story of surrogacy and forced exile exemplified, as Katie Cannon described her, as someone who holds on to life in the face of formidable oppression. One of the others who was a leading scholar was Dolores Williams, who found in Hagar a prototype for African American women's quest for what she called survival quality of life in their struggle against forced surrogacy in Sisters in the Wilderness, the challenge of womanist God talk. And Wilma Ann Bailey asked whether Anabaptist feminists might adopt Hagar as a role model that reflects the lived experiences of women from multiple racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic classes. And Renita Weems links the relationships between Sarah and Hagar with contemporary relationships between white and Black women in Just a Sister Away. In all of these Black women scholars are heirs to an older tradition of Africans enslaved in America appropriating biblical Hagar as their spiritual mother and they as Hagar's children, a tradition that has since been handed down to me. And as a seminary student, I wrote a biblical exegesis paper on Hagar and Sarah using an intersectional lens of race, gender, sexuality, and power. So you can see, even as a seminary student, this examination of these two women was bubbling. In This Woman's Son Shall Not Inherit with My Son, the politics of motherhood in the Sarah Hagar narratives, which is the chapter that I'm examining this evening. I examine the complex relationship between Sarah and Hagar in the book of Genesis. I argue that the narrative is not simply a story about two women and their sons, but a political allegory about the construction of identity and the exclusion of certain groups from the community based on the politics of belonging. The stories of Sarah and Hagar offer readers fertile territory for applying an intersectional analysis, as I've already said, but I also believe that Hagar had been sufficiently analyzed by those feminist and womanist interpreters that I named previously. And after that paper I wrote in seminary, I was like, okay, I'm done. I can move on to other projects. But two events put the narrative right back in the forefront of my research interests. And the first was a job interview that included giving a lecture before the students in the search committee. And I chose to lecture on Sarah and Hagar because I had introduced their stories in a class that I was teaching at the time on women in biblical literature. The assigned text, Helpmates, Harlots, and Heroes, Women's Stories in the Hebrew Bible, raised issues of ethnicity, race, and gender in the Bible when reading about Sarah and Hagar. And most of my students were unaware of the African presence in the Bible, or that there were these racial dynamics from modern racial constructs, as well as the intersection of gender. And so this was new to them, and I took that and said, well, let me use that so I don't have to reinvent the wheel to do my interview. And then the second event was the invitation, after I was hired, I did get the job, was to revise the lecture for publication in the institution's journal. And so it allowed me to continue to engage with this then feminist theory of gender and nation using this intersectional framework that I had begun in my dissertation. This version in the published book is a revised and expanded version of that article because I have wrestled further with these narratives and have adopted Nira Yuval Davis's framework, again, of the politics of belonging, which she hadn't written about at the time that I wrote my dissertation. And so I came to see more fully how significant maternal matters were for the construction of these stories in nationhood and national interests in both the ancient world and contemporary world. As we engage the text, we first learn in Genesis 11:30 that Sarah, wife of Abraham, was barren. As if to emphasize this point, the text adds that she had no child. Thus, motherhood, or the lack thereof, matters. The narrator has emphasized that for a reason. And the narrator reiterates this fact in Genesis 16:1 by reporting that Sarah bore Abraham no children. Older commentaries view Sarah's maternal status as Abraham's problem. His wife was barren, thus he had no heirs. But God had promised Abraham on at least 3 occasions that he would have descendants too many to count. But here we are 4 chapters later, and Abraham still does not have a son. Thus, this pericope is often entitled Promise Delayed. But from my womanist perspective, the focus is on Sarah. Her infertility is seen through her eyes. The report that Sarah is still barren matters to her for at least 2 reasons. For one, some scholars suggest that in a patriarchal world, a woman's barrenness could be a source of shame, ridicule, and blame for reproductive failure. At least one scholar called it a misfortune of overwhelming proportions. And certainly in the ancient world, they didn't know how reproduction worked, and they thought women's wombs were like fields, and you just planted a seed and you watered it and it grew, and so it, like the land, if a woman didn't get pregnant, it was because her womb field was barren. It had nothing to do with male and semen or anything else. It was the woman's fault. And so, and therefore it was the woman who felt the shame of this. But also, Sarah's social and economic stability depended on her having a male protector. As long as Abraham was alive, she was secure. But if he died, her circumstances would be tenuous. In ancient Israel, a widow was a woman whose husband had died and left her without a male heir to take her into his home and care for her. And so that's one of the other ways I teach students that how gender, not only is Hebrew, the language gendered, but like nouns could be masculine if you've taken a foreign language, masculine or feminine or neutral in some languages. But that in Hebrew, there's not even a term for widower. There's only widow, because men just, it's not, if they don't have a wife and they don't have children, they're still going to be secure. Whereas, and so there's just not a word for widower. And so Sarah's socioeconomic status as a free woman of great wealth accords her at least one option. She owned an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar, and ancient family legal codes granted her the prerogative as a barren wife to use her slave as a surrogate to attain motherhood and to avoid divorce. Surrogacy is one state of motherhood presented in the narrative. Surrogacy means being appointed to act in the place of another. Sarah blames God for her predicament and orders Abraham to have sexual relations with Hagar to bear a child so that Sarah could be built up. So again, I'm trying to get you to see that this is Sarah's story and this is Sarah's problem, not about Abraham. Marion Cartzell explains that, quote, motherhood, traditionally connected to pregnancy, birth-giving, and breastfeeding, is renegotiated and divided into three stages or qualities, end quote, in the discourse on surrogacy. The genetic mother, whose eggs were fertilized to produce the child. The gestational or biological mother, who carries and delivers the baby. The juridical or social mother, who legally has the right to raise the child as her own. And thus we find in the text three states of motherhood in Genesis 16. We have the juridical or social motherhood represented by Sarah, because she's the one who would receive the child legally, and genetic and gestational motherhood represented by Hagar. So if Hagar became pregnant and gave birth, the child would belong to Sarah as the legal mother. According to Raymond Westbrook, as Sarah's female slave, Hagar's sexuality and reproductive capacity were her mistress's possessions to, quote, exploit or dispose of, like any other beneficial aspect of property, end quote. The power differential between the two women based on the multidimensional intersection of ethnicity, gender, and legal status, or socioeconomic status, leaves Sarah in the position of power as a woman in a patriarchal society. And it has mostly gained recognition since the entrance of women biblical scholars in the academy. Sarah's plan is successful. Hagar gives birth to a son, Ishmael. And although Hagar was the genetic and biological mother to Ishmael, it was in Sarah's personal interest that she be Ishmael's socio-legal mother. By providing Abraham with a legal heir and legatee, Sarah both retains her status and secures her economic future through motherhood. Motherhood matters. Things take a turn in Genesis 21, and the status of motherhood changes for both women. The narrator reports that God remembered Sarah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son, Isaac. She has gone from socio-legal motherhood to biological and gestational motherhood, which in her situation carries a higher social esteem. Until now, Ishmael was still considered Sarah's son, although the writer refers to him as Hagar's son in Genesis 21. Ishmael is also considered the firstborn son of Abraham and patrilineal heir. The situation turns not just on Isaac's birth, but on his weaning. Tammy Schneider notes that, quote, the feast and what it symbolizes causes Sarah to consider the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac in a new light because of Isaac's new situation. Ishmael is distanced by Sarah and the deity as Abraham's heir in favor of Isaac. End quote. In the political project of motherhood, biology, birth order, nor theologically determinative male genital circumcision combined do not make Ishmael an insider in Israel. The requisite belonging is the right socio-judicial mother, Sarah, which gives Isaac the right credentials. Once the patrilineal line of descent has been safely secured by Isaac, Sarah secures a firm and future position for herself in Abraham's household through the birth of her son. Thus, Naomi Steinberg rightfully notes that a woman's power comes through her son. Only Sarah is the rightful mother of the nation of Israel, as she has the acceptable ethnic and class status. But it is only first with the help of Hagar, then the deity, that Sarah achieves this honorific. Motherhood matters. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have begun to read biblical texts. I'd already begun reading the biblical text through a womanist lens as the politics of belonging. And I had found that using feminist theory of gender and nation, which intersected with this approach, looks at how women affect and are affected by national processes and projects. Maternal matters have come to be particularly important in my research. As a Black woman, as Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the U.S. In contemporary U.S. politics of belonging, maternal matters play out in population policies. In her article, Producing the Mothers of the Nation, Race, Class, and Contemporary U.S. Population, so now I'm bringing it from the biblical context to the contemporary U.S. Political processes. In her article, Producing the Mothers of the Nation, Race, Class, and Contemporary U.S. Population Policies, Patricia Hill Collins, another sociologist, traces how ideas of motherhood influence who get to belong as a U.S. citizen and the government officials who decide, using population policies as their guide. For example, Collins examined U.S. population policies targeted towards middle-class white women, working-class white women, African-American women, and undocumented immigrant Latinas to demonstrate how such regulations support the increased fertility of so-called desirable mothers and discourages the fertility of quote-unquote unfit mothers. She found that middle-class and affluent white women, who are considered emblematic of the nation, enjoy less intrusive, privatized population policies. Black women who are treated as second-class citizens are deemed unfit to pass on national culture and therefore are subjected to coercive population policies. Collins remarks that, quote, because Black women are, quote-unquote, unfit mothers, they become undeserving of the benefits of belonging to the American national family, end quote. Working-class white women fared only a little better than Black women. While better off socially than Black women, they are still regarded as less fit social mothers than middle-class white women. As genetic and gestational mothers of white children, they are beneficial for providing middle-class white mothers with adoptive children. Collins argues that the decrease in adoptable white children has contributed to recent efforts to limit access to abortion for working-class and poor white women. Undocumented Latinas are a group that replaced Black women as social mothers for middle-class and affluent white women, but are regarded by anti-immigrant activists as, quote, economic welfare burdens, end quote. Therefore, their entry into the nation is discouraged. The social value of women in the U.S. is in bearing children, but not just any children, but rather healthy white children for the national interests of the nation. Nira Yuval Davis also makes the connection between population policies, abortion access, and citizenship. She maintains that, quote, population policies and women's reproductive rights are therefore closely interrelated, and both of them affect and are affected by the ways various nationalist projects view the size and quality of the pool of genes, and that's in quotes, in the national collectivity and how these should be controlled and reproduced, end quote. The emotional attachments to belonging and the relationship to creating the boundaries that divide insiders and outsiders in the politics of belonging are what Sarah Ahmed refers to as the cultural politics of emotion. According to Ahmed, emotions such as fear and hatred can move individuals to create borders. Emotions explain how individuals are affected by others or moved by others. Emotions can also move individuals to defend the established borders once they feel that they have been transgressed. In today's political climate, some of the fears expressed are around issues of motherhood, or the lack thereof, immigration, and feminism. They fear that the falling birth rate is an existential threat to white America. Thus, there is this push for certain couples to have bigger families. Immigration is a threat because the wrong people are entering the country legally or illegally and producing children who are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, end quote. In this woman's son shall not inherit with my son, I have examined I've examined the complex relationship between Sarah and Hagar in the book of Genesis, and I have argued that the narrative is not simply a story about two women and their sons. I did say that before. In conclusion, I have focused on how motherhood is used to find and differentiate Sarah and Hagar. Sarah, the free woman and wife of Abraham, is presented as the ideal mother, while Hagar, the enslaved Egyptian woman, is seen as a threat to the family. This distinction is used to justify the expulsion of Hagar and her son Ishmael from the family, ensuring that Isaac, Sarah's son, will be the sole heir to Abraham's legacy, and Sarah becomes the mother of the nation of Israel, and Abraham the heir. Who's your mama matters. Thank you.
Wow, that was so insightful, so insightful. If you're joining us, we're with Dr. Lovelace, and she's sharing with us from her book, A Womanist Reading of Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. And she's going to be doing this series every Wednesday here at 7 p.m. at First Reformed Church. And we're doing this with Pine Street Presbyterian Church. And so again, good evening to all of you. Good evening to all of you. I'm just humbled to sit with Dr. Lovelace. I think she's one of the most brilliant theologians I know, and I'm humbled to say that I know her. And so we're grateful that she's able to share her book with us. Man, Dr. Lovelace, could you share with us a little bit about what sparked your interest with Sarah and Hagar?
So what sparked my interest with Sarah and Hagar, as I mentioned, is that Hagar as the biblical symbolic mother of African descended people. She's been a sympathetic figure, not just for black women, but there have been two perspectives of this Sarah and Hagar. You've had the perspective of Sarah as the wealthy owner of Hagar, and therefore she has a right to treat Hagar in any way that she sees fit. And so if you read further down what I didn't cover, and when Hagar becomes pregnant, she looks down upon, she says that the Hebrew, that Sarah's esteem was lowered in her eyes, literally is what the Hebrew says. And so there's this tension, and Sarah physically mistreats Hagar, and she runs away. And so there's that perspective that, well, again, it's her slave woman, it's in her right. On the other side are those who have been very sympathetic towards Hagar as this exile in the wilderness with her son Ishmael. And so for people who feel like they're the outsiders and they've been exiled, that she has been kind of a patron saint for those who feel excluded. And so because of the tradition of womanist scholars, mostly black women, South Asian, African women scholars who have looked at Hagar, there had just been this long tradition. And so being very familiar with that story and reading their perspectives as I did my own research, and engaging their research helped to fuel my interest in studying Hagar. But again, I also had reached that point where I really felt that she had been done enough. Everyone had written about her, and I really just wanted to move on. But when it came to an intersectional analysis, that story just was dead on. It had the race, ethnicity, it had the gender, it had the class. And so it was the perfect story for me to go back to.
Dang. Yeah, when you were talking about Hagar's status as an enslaved Hebrew in the story, what was the significance of that?
The significance is that this is someone who does not have their own personal autonomy. She can't make decisions for herself. She doesn't have certainly the freedom to leave. She has, but in this situation, and when I talk about looking at the power dynamics between Sarah and Hagar through the lens of those two women instead of Abraham, again, this is not Abraham's problem. We talk about Abraham and the promise delayed, and there were other attempts. One of the earlier stories was that he could adopt. I forget the name of I think it was his nephew, and God was like, no, you don't need to adopt someone to have an heir. You're going to have a child from your own loin. And so we always, throughout, traditionally have read it through the lens of Abraham being fatherless, and we know that he's the father of the nation, and so he's got to have a son. But in the case of looking at it through gender and looking at it through these two women, there is a power dynamic that's unavoidable of Sarah having control over her slave woman's sexuality, to say that I'm giving you to my husband to produce a child so that I can be built up, that I, who have had my esteem lowered because of my barrenness in society, I could be built up by giving this woman to my husband as a secondary wife to produce a child for me. And so that is
and then Sarah is mentioned later, especially in the New Testament. And again, there's this insider-outsider way of that Paul uses to define certain groups of people. So Sarah has just, Hagar has traditionally been seen as the ultimate outsider.
I noticed in in that chapter of this woman's son shall not inherit with my son, you talk about the politics of belonging. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. The politics of belonging, as I mentioned, was coined by Nir Yuval Davis, who's an Israeli-British sociologist, and she has really been on the forefront. Others have followed her, but she was the leader in noticing that it's not about belonging. It's not about what makes you feel comfortable, what makes you feel at home with a certain group, what makes you an insider. It's the politics of belonging. It's who gets to decide, who makes the decisions, or what makes one an insider or outsider, and who gets to decide. One of the examples she gives, I don't know anything about cricket, but she talks about in Britain, insiders and outsiders, and therefore the politics of it, is based on who you root for, which cricket team you root for. So if you're a real British citizen, you root for the British team. But a lot of citizens who were ancestral heritage was from India would root for the Indian team, and so therefore they weren't regarded as real Brits. And so it's those kind of politics that determine insiders and outsiders, and that was one of the examples that she gave as she looks at what are the politics that determine who's really acceptable or who's an insider and who gets excluded.
Okay. We hope you're getting your questions together. If you're watching us online, we hope you're getting your questions together. We're going to close with a couple of moments of Q&A with Dr. Lovelace. I love how you gave your interpretation of understanding motherhood and family and inheritance in both the biblical and the modern context. What were some of those implications?
Some of the implications of motherhood in which context? I'm sorry.
In regards to Sarah and Hagar, because she was barren, so how,
So in terms of, again, looking at the politics of the social political implications then and now, is that first you have, when I talked about the different stages of surrogacy, and so that your motherhood was determined by, again, the juridical or legal, gestational, biological, that in each of those situations, the law could determine who could raise a child and who couldn't. And so you have, in the end, first it's the deity who has some control over the situation, because it's the deity, it says in the text that it's the deity who has closed Sarah's womb. And so you have first the deity, but then you have Sarah, who has the ancient laws of surrogacy that allowed for her to give her slave woman as a wife to Abraham to produce a child for her. So you've got the law, and then you have her rights over over Hagar's sexuality. So all of those different power dynamics determine both motherhood, and then also who gets to raise which son, and then therefore the status of that son in terms of the inheritance, his legacy, and who gets to be a member of the nation of Israel and who gets excluded.
Wow, wow. We're going to now open it up. We're going to open it up to some questions. And we're talking about who's your mama? Why does it matter in the Old Testament and today in the politics of belonging with Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. So that we're able to do this so that you all that are at home can hear online. This is our first time doing this live, so bear with us. We're going to use that mic to field the questions, and would you mind going to the podium to answer the questions? Thank you. All right. So we'll open it up to our audience, and they can ask the questions, and we'll field it to Dr. Lovelace.
Dr. Lovelace, I want to thank you for coming in tonight. There's quite a lot to unpack here, to be very honest, as I'm looking at this and taking some notes, to be very honest. But my first question, very basic, is why did you feel a need to write this book? What was missing or what wasn't out there from this perspective? So why did you feel a need to write this book?
That is a great question. The book came about in pieces. There wasn't at the time it wasn't a book that was written from beginning to end. I didn't have a thesis, and then each chapter was built on the thesis. Instead, it was, I have been working with this theory on the politics of belonging, biblical texts from a womanist hermeneutics. And then, as I mentioned, the first chapter was already published in a journal, but I had more to say because in that original article, I don't deal with the politics of belonging. I deal with the feminist theory of gender and nation. I introduced that as a methodological approach. But Nira Yuval Davis hadn't written about the politics of belonging yet. And I have followed her career, so my scholarship is tagged along to her scholarship. And so by that time, I had more to say, and so I revised and expanded the original article. And then two of the chapters 3 and 4, were in my dissertation. And again, I had not used the politics of belonging yet. And so I revised and expanded those chapters because I never published my dissertation. And so that was also an opportunity to get out into the world what I had written about as a student in defense of my PhD. And then chapter 2 is original. That one next week is when I discuss that one, is on Genesis 9, the so-called curse of Ham. And ironically, there are no women except for Noah's wife and the presumed daughters or wives of his sons. But interestingly, that was the one chapter that didn't have any mothers as a focus. But I still had a lot to say in that chapter about the politics of belonging and in ancient world and contemporary U.S. politics. And so chapter 1 was an introduction not only to the book, but to what drove this bill. As I think through the chapters, was in America the ongoing quest for Black Americans to be accepted as first-class citizens by birthright. And so I open with, in that context, blacks freed and enslaved had the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other hand. And that was when they preached, it was the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other. And that we are still in this struggle for acceptance, for freedom and justice in this democracy. And we are so committed to the continuity, the stability, the strength of living in a democratic nation, to be considered second-class citizens. And so that is really, that's the thread line throughout every chapter is, and how then when I discuss the US politics part, is the dismissal or the erasure or the attempts to the black presence and black contributions to our country. So that's the through line. And so, but I also talk about what is womanist biblical interpretation as a biblical scholar, that there are, I hope there's about, I think we might have reached 50 now, but at the time I think I wrote it, there were only 40 black women in the US with PhDs in Bible, Old Testament or New Testament. And so I talk about that, and I talk about the politics of belonging, and it's like I set up the rest of the book in chapter 1. And then in the last chapter, I'll probably say it again, but that's when I say, somewhere along the line, I realized that this book was about motherhood. And that was not the intention at all. But it just went there, so.
I'm just curious about the your theme of sense of belonging, and I obviously I can't relate. So a woman of color that is challenged with let's say underprivileged, reading this moment, you said there's a sympathetic figure in Hagar, and I think of it, if there's a woman of color reading that. That it's kind of a betrayal of belonging. If you know that the privileged, maybe God's privileged is through Sarah, how does a woman of color reading that, like, stay in tune with God's story and not get deterred because of relating with Hagar, cast into the desert, even though God says we're still going to make a nation out of your son? It may not be the Christian nation. And I'm just curious, how does a woman of color read that if they relate with Hagar and don't feel a sense of belonging with Sarah?
Thank you for that question. So what I didn't say in the lecture is in the book, in the chapter, the journal article, that I mentioned Renita Weems as one who early on had read them through through U.S. Contemporary relations of a white mistress and a black slave woman. But what I say, I problematize that because I said actually in the ancient world, and especially in the the area we're talking, the Israel-Palestine, the Egypt, the Fertile Crescent, that area, by our modern racial constructs, there are no white people. The first mention of what we would consider white are the Hyksos who come from over the seas and invade Egypt. And so, we have that period of non-Egyptian pharaohs ruling in Egypt. They're the Hyksos. And so we're talking shades of black and brown and olive and caramel, but there are no whites. And so I remind the reader that what's really happening here, if we read it through those modern constructs, are social class dynamics. And sometimes we have to see, as black women reading this text, we need to see ourselves as those middle-class, privileged women who encounter that Latina immigrant or a third worlder, someone from the global south who's poor, has less than us, and we are the ones who are in power and privilege. And so therefore we can relate to both of them. Are there any on YouTube?
I'm looking now.
Okay, well, go ahead.
You know, and I'm listening to this, and especially in the concept of belonging, but let me focus on the concept of who's your mama. We're currently living in a time where citizenship, birthright citizenship, is being challenged. The 14th Amendment citizenship article is being challenged. And I know you didn't see this coming, or maybe you did, actually. But is there a connect? Because if you are, you know, there's a movement now that if you were born in the United States, but to undocumented parents, that somehow you are not a citizen of the United States. That's been, I mean, do you see the connection here at all with, you know, with Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael, where he is sent off, he is sent away. And, you know, I think the concept of who's your mama matters today.
It does. So if we're going to be honest, we have to talk about that there is this climate in the U.S. right now that if you are not white, male, able-bodied, Protestant, wealthy, in passive, we would say that was the normative and everyone else had to find their way in that context, because in terms of privilege and power. But then over the years, we passed laws to try and expand and include others who didn't have the same starting point or same foothold. And so there is this return to this idea that if you don't fit that norm, that you are incompetent, you are illegal, you don't belong. And so when we think of the reason we have the 14th Amendment was because of the freeing of the slaves, and then slaves being that made Africans born in the U.S. citizens. And so if you are trying to undo and erase the idea of blacks as belonging, and then you just take everyone else who's not in that norm along with it, that is what's behind this. And so, you know, being honest that we have this sense of trying to erase blacks in America, when you have an executive order that says that the Black History Month cannot be celebrated in the federal government. What has that got to do with the stability or the readiness of the nation? And so it's constitutional. Prayerfully, it will not, stare decisis, we've thought other things would stand the test of time, and they haven't. And so I'm prayerful that when it comes to the Supreme Court, because that's what they're pushing for, they're hoping that this Supreme Court will overturn it, that it will hold, and then we go on to the next challenge.
We thank you for your questions. Dean Lovelace, could you give us a quick little preview of what's to come next week? Topic?
So, actually, can't, before I walked in, I said the one thing that I forgot to bring with me was my own book. So, I don't have it with me, but, do you have the chapter?
Genesis 9?
Well, I said that, but the title actually is real catchy, so let me find it real quick.
While she's doing that, we want to encourage you to pick up her book, A Womanist Reading of Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. It's on all of our book platforms as well.
Outsider Within, a Vineyard, a Curse, and U.S. Racial Politics.
We thank Dean Lovelace for coming and sharing with us on tonight, and thank Pine Street Presbyterian for joining us. We'll be back next Wednesday at 7 p.m. again with Dr. Lovelace as she shares in these adult forums. Thank you so much for joining us. Peace and love.